Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Chris Ragan on pricing carbon, the Ecofiscal Way Forward. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And every week, my co-host Andrew Thompson and I are happy to welcome a guest into the studios here in Waterloo and talk about some important issue on the global agenda. And today, it's my pleasure to welcome Chris Ragan, who's chair of the Ecofiscal Commission as well as associate professor of economics at McGill University. And welcome to CIGI and to Waterloo.
Thank you for having me.
And you are chair of a commission that's just issued a very important report. So let's talk both about the commission and the report, starting with the commission, the Ecofiscal Commission, and maybe something a lot of people haven't heard about yet. So could you tell us a little bit about that and what its mandate is?
So the Ecofiscal Commission launched November 4th of last year. We had some, a year or two kind of getting ready before we went live. But on November 4th, we launched to the public and our website went live and our first report was released. And our first report was called Smart, Practical, Possible. And it made the case for what we call ecofiscal policies, which are policies that price pollution, whether you're talking about carbon emissions or residential garbage by the bag, right? Pricing pollution and driving environmental improvements by creating an incentive to reduce pollution, but then also using the revenues to recycle back into the economy to generate economic benefits. So what really brings together the commissioners and our advisors, and we can talk about them in a bit, is the shared conviction that Canada can do better in terms of environmental performance and economic performance, and that those two things really go together, and that by rejigging our fiscal structures, right, by attaching prices to pollution and then recycling those revenues, we can actually get improvements in both. So back in November 4th, we issued this first report, and just on April 7th, a few weeks ago, we introduced our second report, which is called The Way Forward. And it's a report about carbon pricing and about the benefits of carbon pricing and about why that carbon pricing can happen very practically and effectively at the provincial level.
Mm-hmm. Now, who commissioned the commission and who are the members?
So the members are 12 policy experienced economists from across the country. So I am the chair of the commission, but I'm also one of the 12 commissioners. We also have an advisory board made up of really exceptional Canadians. They're former politicians from across the political spectrum. So Paul Martin and Jean Charest and Mike Harcourt and Bob Rae. They're leaders from business, Dominic Barton from McKinsey and Steve Williams from Suncor. And there's others, and I'm going to forget some names, but from business, from civil society, from the environment, and from politics. And they kind of help us convey the message that the policies we're talking about aren't left or right or business or labor or conservative or liberal or NDP. They're just down the middle of the road sensible policies. And so that's who we are as commissioners and the advisors. And your question was who commissioned us? And the answer is we brought ourselves together. We come together with this shared conviction. And so we are fully independent. And this is, I guess, the real answer to the question, which is we aren't connected to a government. We aren't connected to a political party or a political platform. We speak as independent individuals. And we think that independence is a really important part of the credibility of what we're saying.
Great. Now, the new report you mentioned, the second one, The Way Forward. Tell us a little bit about the general goal of this and the main findings.
So the goal is to help governments in this country find a practical way forward for doing better in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we start the report by saying, look, we're not climate scientists. We're going to accept the overwhelming scientific consensus that climate change is a real problem, that it is fundamentally driven by human action, and that there is a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got to basically start that and get that out of the way within the first few pages. And then the question is, well, what do you do? What do you do if you want to if you want to introduce policies to make further progress. And we point out that each Canadian province has adopted a target for emissions reductions by 2020, and most of those provinces are going to miss those targets with their policies currently in place, and they're going to miss them in some cases by a long way. And so if you are a government that has a target and that wants to achieve it, you have a choice. You have a choice about using direct regulatory approach or using a market-based approach that has pricing, some form of pricing at its core. So the first central message in the report is that carbon pricing is a much more cost-effective way of reducing emissions than a regulatory approach. And we have some modeling results that shows that province by province. And the second main argument in the report is that doing this provincially, province by province, just makes good practical sense in the Canadian context. So we can drill down on those details if you'd like. But that's really the central messages.
Now, my understanding is there's a global consensus on that, right? That carbon pricing is the way to go, as opposed to
Well, I think there's a global
regulation.
consensus that there is a problem,
Right.
and that there's a need to reduce emissions. And I think there's a growing global consensus, certainly growing global momentum toward carbon pricing. One of the figures that we reproduce in our report is published by the World Bank, and it's a map of the world that shows all of the jurisdictions, whether they're countries or subnational governments, that have either introduced carbon pricing or are in the process of doing it. And every year that map just gets more and more color on it. And so the world is moving in this direction, and for good reason.
Right. Now, some of the provinces have been pricing carbon.
Yeah.
British Columbia has a carbon tax. Quebec's had a cap and trade system, and now Ontario has announced it's going to, as I understand, buy into Quebec's with California. Interesting trans-border cap and trade market there. What are the experiences of these particular provinces with their particular carbon pricing schemes, and is one got certain advantages, disadvantages vis-a-vis the other?
And you left one other province off your list. So Alberta was in fact the first jurisdiction in North America to have carbon pricing. Their system is, so we spend considerable number of pages in section 5 of the report talking about the details of these three systems, BC, Alberta, and Quebec. So BC's got a carbon tax. It's had a tax in place since 2008, and that tax is actually, it's a very well-designed tax. And it has, the evidence suggests that it has, even though we only have 6 years of evidence, so I think we don't have enough evidence really to come up with a conclusive result. But it's very suggestive at this point that it has been successful in driving per capita emissions, reductions in per capita emissions. Alberta has a more complex system. It's a regulatory system that's got elements of pricing. It's a little bit harder to understand. It's designed very differently than BC's carbon tax. And it has not had that much of an effect on emissions so far. Quebec has a cap and trade system that's very well designed, but it's a younger system. So its system just really went live, and it's connected with California with the Western Climate Initiative. And its system just really went live late last year. And so too early to tell of its effects, but it's designed so well that it looks like it will be effective. And then Ontario has just announced its intention to introduce a cap and trade system that will link with Quebec and California.
What about other jurisdictions globally? Is there any obvious advantage to the carbon tax versus the cap and trade approach?
Yeah, this is a great question. And we debated this among the commissioners. And we came to the conclusion, the more and more we thought about these systems, the more we realized that you can design a carbon tax well, and you can also design it really poorly. And you can design a cap and trade system well, and you can design it really poorly. And so when you design the two systems well, and BC's tax and Quebec's cap and trade system, you look at these systems, they're completely different systems. One's a tax, one's a cap and trade. There are some important differences, but there are also some really important similarities. And as long as they're designed well, we actually decided that we couldn't come out in favor of making a blanket statement in favor of a tax or in favor of a cap and trade, because it came down to the details. And so these systems are really, when they're well designed, they're much more similar than they are different, because they both attach a price to carbon, they both produce an incentive to reduce emissions, they both produce an incentive to innovate, they both create revenue or generate revenue that can then be recycled. So the systems, when they're well designed, are very, very similar. So then the details, or the devil then is in the details. And you say, and we spend a lot of time talking about the details and comparing those three systems in Canada.
What are some of the characteristics of a well-designed system? Is it transparency? Is it ease of implementation? Is it ease of monitoring? Is it
Yes.
additional things that aren't coming to
And
my mind at the
additional
moment? What would some of those be?
So we start off, I think actually the administrative simplicity is important. And one thing we say is that a cap and trade system is administratively more complex than a tax. I don't think that needs to be a showstopper, but it's a little bit more complex to do. But that's not a big deal.
Because it involves a market?
Well, basically because you have to create a market. So you create a market in which these permits can be traded, and these permits are going to be are like securities. So you've got to think about the securities regulations aspect to it. Whereas with a tax system, you don't have to do that. So there's a little bit more administrative burden that comes with a cap and trade system, but it's also got some advantages. For example, it's easier to link together two cap and trade systems. It's actually really easy to link together two cap and trade systems. It's much easier to do that than it is to link together two tax systems. So there are advantages. But the things you're looking for in either system are first and foremost stringency. So stringency, think about that as the height of the price. So whether it's the height of the tax or whether it's the height of the price that is the market-determined permit price, it's the stringency that's going to drive the behavioral change. Whether you're talking about households or firms that are cutting back on their emissions, they're going to do that in response to the price incentive. So what you want to do is have that price start at a fairly moderate level, $10, $15, $20 per ton, and then actually ramp that up slowly over time so that you slowly drive that behavioral change. One of the things that you have to think about is that nobody should be looking for dramatic changes in behavior and dramatic changes in emissions in short periods of time. Right? This is a long run game, if you like. I mean, we're designing policy here for not for the next 2 or 3 years, but for the next 2 or 3 generations. So stringency is one thing. Coverage is the other. So this is the fraction of the emissions in the province that are covered by the policy. So if you just designed the system to cover a few sectors and 10% of the emissions, then you wouldn't be surprised that, number one, your policy might be not very cost effective, and number two, it's not going to drive very much emission reductions in the outside 90%. So what you want to do is cast that net as widely as possible so that you can get all the low cost emissions reductions possibilities into the program. So stringency is about the effectiveness of the program. The breadth of coverage is about the cost effectiveness of the policy. So you want to do it as broadly as you can practically do. The third thing is, how do you deal with the competitiveness challenge? So this is the idea that some firms and some sectors are going to be quite emissions intensive. And when you attach a carbon price, they're going to see an increase in their costs. And if the neighboring jurisdiction isn't doing the same thing, they might have an incentive to just pop across the border and set up shop there instead. In which case, you would bear the economic cost of their departure, but globally emissions wouldn't have changed, and so this would be a bad outcome. So you've got to think about this. And you've got to identify the sectors and the firms in those sectors that are particularly vulnerable on this front. And then, and this brings us to the fourth thing, you've got to think about how you recycle those revenues. And in BC's case, for example, they recycled, by law, it is a revenue neutral carbon tax. So they recycled all of the every dollar of carbon revenues are recycled through personal and corporate tax reductions and direct transfers to low-income families. Alberta recycles its revenues by supporting technological development in the oil patch, mostly in the oil patch. Quebec recycles its revenues kind of using a more balanced portfolio of choices. But on the competitiveness issue, one of the ways you might want to think about recycling the revenues is a way to deal with that competitiveness challenge. So transitional plans, for example, that help firms transition to a lower carbon operations so that there's a level playing field between them and the other jurisdictions. So those are the four big things, but there are many other smaller things as well.
Does revenue neutrality cut into your benefit in terms of carbon reduction? Are you in effect sort of reducing the cost of, or reducing the incentive to save on the carbon side by effectively promising people that you'll be subsidizing something else?
I would say that the policy could be equally, two policies could be equally effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether they are revenue neutral or not. But whether they're revenue neutral or not, and frankly, how you recycle the revenues, comes down to what the economic benefits are that you get from the policy. So if you were a jurisdiction that was particularly concerned about the effect on economic growth, you might choose to recycle the revenues by lowering corporate income taxes, because there's a lot of evidence that corporate income taxes are the most growth retarding tax we've ever invented. Okay? But if you were particularly concerned about the impact on low-income families, you might choose to recycle the revenues, all or part, to help that. If you're desperately in need of critical public infrastructure, and most jurisdictions are these days, you might say, well, we're going to get the economic benefits from actually using these revenues to finance critical infrastructure, public transit, other infrastructure. And there's other options as well. So I would say that the way you design the system, not on the revenue recycling, but the way you design the actual carbon pricing system is going to drive the effectiveness of the policy and the environmental benefits, but the way you recycle the revenues is going to drive the nature of the economic benefits you get. And it's the two things together that really matter. So very often carbon pricing gets talked about only as the first part, just the attach the price to carbon and then that's it. But the second part, and this is a really key point of the Ecofiscal Commission, because this is the second part of all of the policies we'll talk about, is what do you do with the revenues? And how you recycle those revenues is going to drive the nature of the economic benefits you get.
Now, I understand that BC's experience with the carbon tax is that it hasn't hurt growth. In fact, people trumpet it as a prime example of how you can have climate-friendly carbon pricing and actually boost your economic growth. I'm not sure if counterfactual plays out if you can model it such that if you hadn't had the carbon pricing,
modeling the counterfactual is always rather challenging.
BC's growth would have been higher or lower, but it's held up as a counter argument to those who say these are growth killers.
Yeah. So the counterfactual argument is always very, very challenging, and we just have to live with that. But the best evidence at this point in BC's case says, and let me just back up, BC's carbon tax applies to 6, I think, different fossil fuels. Okay, and it's a tax that applies based on carbon content. And so what have we seen in the first 6 years or first 5 years of the BC carbon tax is that per capita, and this is, you've got to look at things in per capita terms, especially in BC's case, because their population is growing by 1.5% per year, right? So you want to look at things in per capita terms. And per capita fuel use on those taxes, those fuels that have been taxed, has fallen by 16% over that first 4 or 5 years. Whereas in the rest of the country, it went up by 3%. So that's a 19 percentage point difference in per capita fuel use. And of course, use of those fuels translates kind of directly into emissions, because that's where the emissions are coming from. And at the same time, per capita GDP in BC has basically tracked or slightly outperformed per capita GDP in Canada. So you could at least, you know, you've got 6 years of data, so you really can't say this is absolutely conclusive. Absolutely conclusive evidence in economics is always rather challenging. But with 6 years of data, I think you can look at that and say, wow, this is pretty suggestive that you know, emissions are falling for some reason. That tax was in place, and the economy has tracked the rest of the countries. So that's pretty good.
And how much flight has there been to climate unfriendly jurisdictions on the part of industry?
Well,
there must be anecdotal cases.
I think very little. The one that comes to mind is, and relates back to the competitiveness issue and the recycling of revenues, is cement. So some of the cement industry claims that, or the cement industry, I think, claims that that they have seen an increase in, and the data bears this out, that there's been an increase in the market share of imported cement from Washington and Oregon because that's coming from jurisdictions that aren't exposed to the tax. Now, one of the problems is in doing this analysis, and we are actually doing some analysis in this, but it's preliminary at this point, is that other things were changing at the same time. So at the same time that this market share was changing, the Canadian dollar was also changing in fairly substantial ways.
Much stronger.
And that's clearly going to have an effect. But it's worth noting that BC in their budget from a couple of months ago took this concern seriously, and in a heads-up way, they have decided that they're going to take a small amount of the carbon pricing revenues and they're going to design a transitional program for the cement industry. It was $22 million, I think, over 3 years to help them transition to a lower carbon process, so that by the end of that 3 years, if it works, by the end of that 3 years, the BC cement industry would be less disadvantaged, if you like, than the outside industry. So that's a good example of a emissions intensive and trade exposed industry, and how the competitiveness challenge being quite real and how you can deal with it. Interesting also, we had an event, Ecofiscal event, on the day after this report came out in Toronto on April 8th, and that event was partnered with Sustainable Prosperity and the Cement Association of Canada.
Oh, really?
So it's interesting that the Cement Association of Canada is actually strongly in favor of carbon pricing. And I think that speaks to, and they're an example of an industry that you would kind of expect not to be in favor of this, but they are.
So looking at the overall trade effects of these kinds of things, I'm curious to know what the picture is in Canada, in NAFTA, and globally. So Canada is famous for having lots of interprovincial trade barriers, and different provinces are now sort of finding their way to...
we've only been working on that for 125 years. But
different provinces are finding their way to different carbon pricing schemes. Is this all going to shake out, or should it shake out? Must it shake out in the long run in terms of some kind of harmonization? If there's to be a net benefit both for the Canadian economy and for the Canadian carbon footprint.
So this is something that the harmonization of the different provincial policies. So let's just imagine that the various provincial governments, they read our report, they were convinced, they introduced carbon pricing policies, and then you would have 10 different independent carbon pricing systems. Then the concern is, how different are these, and will there be some firms, for example, that do some policy shopping, right? They locate here rather than here because of a less stringent carbon price here than here. And that's a very legitimate concern. 2 comments to that. One is, we take this concern very seriously, and this is why in the report we argue that ultimately you do want to have a consistent carbon price, right? You don't want a $20 carbon price there and a $10 price there and a $32 price there. Ultimately, you get the best efficiency gains of this policy and the best cost effectiveness by having a consistent carbon price across the country.
But the scheme could vary.
The scheme could vary. So that's a key point, is that you could have differently designed systems, but consistency in price. But then you still have to then ask the question, how do you get that consistent price? And so what we say is that over time, provinces should, if they're going to introduce a carbon pricing system today, unilaterally, they don't have to wait for anybody, they don't have to wait for anything. They can introduce the policy now. But over time, they should keep an eye on the desire and the benefits that would come from linking their system with others so that you get that consistent carbon price. So that's one comment, is that you do want to have that consistency. But in the short run, it's likely that most of the provinces are starting at a low carbon price. Most of them are at 0 now. They're likely to start in the same way that BC started. BC started at a $10 per ton carbon tax and then ramped up where it's today at 30. So provinces that are going to start with a policy are likely to start in that ballpark, $10, $12, $15. And so even if you have inequality of carbon prices, you're likely to have very small differences in the first few years. And as long as those differences are going to be small, then the problems created from those differences are going to be small. Right. And this brings me to the second point, which is firms locate across provinces for all kinds of reasons. Right? There are already different corporate tax rates. There are different pension regulations. There are different minimum wages. There are different abilities to recruit workers, which in turn depends on different quality of healthcare and different quality of schools and all kinds of other things. So there's already a very complex or multidimensional process that firms go through when they're coming up with making a locational decision. And this would be one, and in the early years, a very small element in that mix.
Many firms operate in many provinces.
Right.
So I would think that from their sort of accounting and transaction cost perspective, they would love it if there were one scheme that they could implement.
And they'd love it if there were a single
jurisdictions.
corporate tax rate, and they'd love it if there was a
Right.
single minimum wage and a single, the one price that, as far as I can tell, is the only price that firms face that is the same price across the country is the price of financial capital. And that's because we live in a world with one central bank and one currency for the country, and financial capital moves at the speed of light.
Right.
So that's the one price that we have equated perfectly across provinces. But it's the one of 10,000 prices.
Right.
So I think this is a concern. I mean, I think it is a legitimate concern when the differences are big, and so you want to make sure that ultimately those differences are eliminated. But I think this concern can be exaggerated, especially in the short run.
I see. Now, you say in the report that it's almost preferable to have the provinces implement carbon pricing as opposed to having a single national federal approach to carbon pricing.
Well, we make
What's
the case
the
that
logic there?
Well, so we make the case that it's a very practical thing for the provinces to do, and so I could make this as a positive statement for the provinces, or as challenges that a federal government, any federal government of any political stripe. This is not a partisan statement. That any federal government that chose to try to do carbon pricing would encounter two challenges. One challenge is that the provinces are very different. Provincial economic structures are quite different. Section 3 in the report, we kind of were reminded and wanted to remind the reader about how different Canadian provinces are. They're different economic structures, they're different energy mixes, they're different emissions profiles, they're just different.
Right.
And you would want to build those differences into the policy. It's just not true that a carbon price is a carbon price is a carbon price. Just for the same reason that we know that the way governments raise their revenues matters. You can't say that a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. It actually matters whether you raise this with a corporate income tax or a personal income tax or a GST. It matters. And it actually matters how you design a carbon price. So you'd want to build those details in. Now, a federal government could do that. A federal government could actually design the policy very differently in each of 10 different provinces. But that's just not usually what federal policy looks like. So it's possible, but it's just difficult. And the second thing is the carbon pricing policies are going to generate revenue. And if that revenue is going to flow from provinces to Ottawa, then that's going to create, I think, both political and economic challenges. Whereas if you do this provincially, you sidestep these complications just instantly, transparently. You say the provinces are going to design the system, and they're going to design it the way that makes most sense for their realities, and they're going to generate those revenues, and they're going to recycle them in the way that makes most sense for their local economies. And so do it provincially. And we should keep in mind that it's already happening provincially. There is momentum there now. Let's build on the momentum.
Right.
And Ontario has just increased the amount of momentum significantly.
Very much so. So if you were going to take the insights from this report and sort of scale them up, say to the NAFTA level or globally, what would the main lessons learned be? What should the rest of the world be thinking about?
What should the rest of the world learn from
Like keep
the
carbon
Ecofiscal
pricing
Commission?
local and keep it...
Well, I think actually, I think the world is actually ahead of us on this. I think there is growing momentum at subnationals. We're seeing this in the UN process. We're seeing more discussion and more participation of the subnationals. So, and maybe it's because other countries are encountering the same sort of challenges that I think we encounter, is that our provinces are different, the subnationals are different. So I suspect the world is ahead of us on this.
Well, very good. Fascinating, complicated, and obviously important topic. Thanks for helping us understand it better. And thanks to our audience for joining us this week on Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.